guest of 2016. I'm really thrilled that Professor Jenny Reisman could be with us today. She's Associate Professor of Behavioral Science in the William Ladany Faculty Scholar at the Booth School of Business. She's been here at UChicago since 2007. She conducts research in the areas of judgment and decision-making and intuitive belief formation, magical thinking, stereotyping and prejudice, and managing emotion. So I think we can all very much benefit from hearing more about this kind of work. So please join me in welcoming Professor Reisman.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. This is a really fun opportunity for me to present my research. So first of all, I'm happy to just talk and save questions for the end, but I'm also perfectly happy to be interrupted as we go if you have questions that you just can't wait on, and certainly if there's anything that's not clear. So I know in advance that I'm used to giving this kind of talk to people who are coming from my discipline in social psychology, and there's just a chance that I'm going to not recognize when I'm sort of just not allowing for the fact that I may be sort of skipping over a few steps. So please interrupt if anything isn't clear. And also if there's other questions, we can do that as we go, or the more conceptual questions we can wait until the end. So my background, my discipline that I'm sort of trained in is as an experimental social psychologist, even though I'm at the business school. You'll see there's going to be almost nothing towards anything business related at all. And my interests are in understanding how people can believe things that aren't true and how they can believe things that they know aren't true. And so I'm going to be trying to dig into the psychological processes that underlie intuitive beliefs to understand how we use our intuitions, in particular when they come into conflict with the product of a more rational or deliberate thought process. And so superstitions and magical thinking is this wonderful space to study the conflict between rational thinking and intuitive beliefs, because for many people, they will sort of describe themselves as being of two minds when it comes to superstitions. So people will tell you explicitly, I'm not superstitious, and then you see them behaving and doing things that suggest otherwise. And so it's a nice place where people are actually sort of even aware of this conflict that they're experiencing themselves. So let me start with a few quotes. And I'll start with some sports fans. These are probably my best inspiration here. First one, this is from last season's baseball. This was a fan who says, I'm not superstitious, but I'm a Jays jinx. I turned on the radio yesterday just to catch the score. Just as they said the score, the other team scored, so I switched right away. Later, just flipping through the TV channels, bang, the Rangers got another run, so relax, Jays fans. I will not listen or watch any games. They are perfect if I stay away. And just to be clear, he's not superstitious. Here was someone, this is a tweeting about hockey. Reese, don't be an idiot. This isn't quantum physics, and you don't have cosmic jinxing powers. You can watch Calgary, LA, but why take that chance? And now, of course, here in Chicago, this is sort of my bread and butter here. This was quite the exciting year for everybody thinking about sports and superstition. This was a tweet that Christopher Hayes sent out. He said, literally just put my Cubs jersey on for good luck like a goddamn 5-year-old, frustrated with himself. And here was a longer quote from a fan who says, intellectually, I know this is a really good baseball team. They won 103 games in the regular season, and there's no reason at all that they shouldn't win. But there's a feeling of doom that hangs over me. Something always intervenes. And the author of the article says to fend off the sense of doom and try to help his team overcome decades of ill fortune. He's wearing the same Cubs hat and sweatshirt to every game he attends, and performs this ritual handshake with his wife Sandy and the third fan before every pitch. With the first pitch, he says, I feel really silly saying this, he admits, but somehow I feel that the whole thing is really delicately balanced, that anything can change it. And maybe the most succinct form of this was this quick quote by Michael Scott, who says, I'm not superstitious, but I am a little stitious. And finally, my very last one to kick it off, so that you know it's not just sports fans or fictional managers. This is at least an anecdote that's described to two scientists talking. One kept glancing at the horseshoe hanging over the door of the others, and finally, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, he demanded, "Niels, it can't possibly be that you, a brilliant scientist, believe that foolish horseshoe superstition." "Of course not," replied the scientist, "but I understand it's lucky whether you believe in it or not. And this is not an ordinary Niels scientist. This story is attributed to Niels Bohr, Nobel Prize winner." And so the question is, how can even the most intelligent people believe things that aren't true and believe things that they themselves recognize as not being true? And so that's what I want to think about. So I'll take a step back to think about traditional accounts that have been offered for magical thinking and superstition. The first big account is a cognitive account, and it's really coming out of anthropology, but then sort of became sort of part of the psychology approach as well, which is to think about cognitive shortcomings of people who hold these beliefs. The idea that people are just not reasoning properly, right? Whether it's not being exposed or not having the capacity to think through things properly and rationally and scientifically, and the idea is then we're left with these silly, faulty beliefs. And the problem is pretty obvious, is that this can't explain everything, right? Because we see very intelligent, well-educated people who still hold on to superstitions. So this can't be sort of the whole story. The other big account that's been offered is a more motivational story. The idea that when you're facing uncertainty and stress and anxiety, when things are hard to predict and hard to control, superstitions and magical beliefs offer you some feeling of control and predictability, and even if it's illusory, even if it's not real, it still feels better than not having it at all. And I think this account, sort of certainly added to the previous one, is getting us closer, but I still think we're leaving a lot unexplored, because I don't think it tells us why ordinary people will hold magical beliefs in fairly ordinary circumstances, and why we form the particular beliefs that we do, as opposed to anything else that we might believe. And so, as a social psychologist, and in particular someone coming from my sort of more narrow area, is someone who studies judgment and decision making, a very popular way to think about things is what's known as sort of a dual process model, thinking about sort of two sets of mental processes that we have, and thinking about whether that account would be useful for understanding superstitions. And so, oops, I skipped one. So I have a recent paper, and I'm going to try to, I had two goals in the paper, and I'm going to try to organize the talk in the same way, what I'll tell you about today. The first is to start with the basic dual process model that's been offered, and then take that and apply it to this case of superstition and magical thinking, and think about whether we get any sort of value from that. Do we learn anything more about this space if we use a basic dual process model? But then I want to sort of say, although I do think we learn a lot, we don't have the ability to explain some of those examples I started with, like the Niels Bohr, where you simultaneously believe something that you know isn't true. The basic model isn't going to allow us to do that. And so what I'm going to do then is try to use what we see in magical thinking and superstition to refine the dual process model that's been offered more generally in psychology. And so I'm hoping to sort of hit both of those points and tell you about a little bit of the data that I've collected and studies that I've run over the years on those. So first talk about the basic account, tell you about it and some of my work, and then move to the modified account. So here's the basic account. You can see this model set up here. It's pretty straightforward. It's very simple. There's not much to see. This was made very popular by Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So if anybody's read that, this is basically what I'm using here as the basic model. The idea is that we have two different sort of sets of mental processes. The terminology isn't so great, but system one is the set of mental processes that are automatic, that they work without needing any sort of cognitive effort. It just happens quickly and easily without having to try. And that happens all the time. We're sort of, as we're just going about our world, that's always happening. We're always trying to understand our world, and this automatic process is always going. System 2 refers to the set of mental processes that are going to be much more deliberate, that are going to require working memory, that are going to have to require awareness and intent, and that is not always engaged. That has to be sort of actively engaged. And so the basic model that's been offered is that these two different sort of types of processing exist. System 1's always going and offering sort of intuitive judgments. If System 2 doesn't get involved, then whatever that System 1 author was is going to be the judgment and the behavior that you have. If System 2 does become engaged, then it will have an opportunity to override or correct that initial intuition. So here's an example of this from the judgment and decision-making literature. So this problem, a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? For most people, the number that springs to mind, the System 1 answer, is 10 cents. If you answer 10 cents, it suggests that System 1 was driving the show here. Instead, if you answer 5 cents, the assumption is that System 2 got involved. System 2 tested to realize that if the ball was 10 cents, you're going to end up, it's going to cost too much, right? That your total's not right. And so this model is developed to sort of think about lots of different kinds of problems. This is not magical at all. What I want to do first is suggest that maybe we can use the System 1, System 2 account to think about magical thinking. And so all I'm going to do first is throw in the word magical, right? Nothing about the theory has changed yet. All we've done is add the word magical. And so if we just apply that, the idea is that when a magical intuition is activated, it's going to drive judgment and behavior unless System 2 is engaged, in which case it can correct that initial magical intuition. And what I like about the dual process account, first, is that I think it can accommodate those traditional accounts that I mentioned before. So surely the extent to which you are motivated to manage uncertainty in the moment is going to affect whether or not a magical intuition is activated in the first place. So if you're watching a sporting event live, it's more likely that a superstitious intuition comes to mind than if you're watching it on tape delay. Right? We're going to be able to think about what is going to make an intuition more likely to be activated or not, and something like managing uncertainty is going to play a role there. And then cognitive skills, whether by population or by individual difference, and whether it's by motivation or ability, certainly will probably play out in terms of whether people are likely to engage in a System 2 process, or whether they're more comfortable engaging primarily with their System 1 sort of more automatic sets of processes. But beyond just being able to accommodate those, I think it also, a dual process account will also set up a host of other predictions that I think are useful for understanding superstition and magical thinking. So if magical intuitions are building on System 1 processing, which is shared by everybody, then we should see magical intuitions being widespread. If they're building on System 1 processing, which we know from lots of research builds on certain types of heuristics, rules of thumb, like using similarity to judge likelihood, or using how easy something is when it comes to mind to judge how likely it is, those kinds of heuristics are very likely to be building blocks for lots of different superstitions too, because that's all part of sort of the System 1 set of processes. Magical intuition should be able to occur under conditions of authenticity, so without cognitive effort and without awareness and without intent. And maybe most straightforward from the model is that judgment and behavior should rely on these magical intuitions more to the extent that System 2 is not engaged. And when System 2 becomes engaged, you should be less likely to rely on those magical intuitions. My read of the literature is that there's support for these different predictions. Not that these different studies were run with the goal of testing them, but that the results are consistent with those different predictions. And so I think that the basic dual process model does tell us a lot. But as I alluded to before, I don't think it's going to tell us everything. But what I'd like to do now is tell you about a couple of studies that I have run that speak to some of these predictions. In particular, the idea that that magical beliefs can build on some of these heuristics, like the availability heuristic, and that evidence for it occurring automatically. And so I'm going to describe a couple of studies from an old paper of mine about the belief in tempting fate. So the belief in tempting fate is the idea that negative outcomes seem more likely following certain kinds of behaviors. And so participants will tell us that it's more likely to rain if Julie doesn't bring her umbrella than if she does. They think John, who has applied to Stanford, is going to be less likely to be accepted if he wears his Stanford t-shirt presumptuously than he stuffs it in the drawer when his mom sends it to him. And students in class think they're more likely to be called on at random by a professor in a lecture hall if they're not prepared than if they are prepared for class, if they have been reading. And we think that this belief builds on the combination of two automatic mental processes. One is the negativity bias, which is that negative outcomes capture our attention. And second is availability. Availability, which is that once something captures our attention, we use that as a cue in judging how likely it is to occur. And so I'll tell you about a couple of studies that we ran to test this idea whether these negative outcomes seem especially likely following tempting fate behaviors because the negative outcomes spring to mind, and then we use that to judge how likely it is. So in this study, we had to come up with a way to measure how accessible different outcomes were on people's minds. And so what we did was we created a paradigm where people came to the lab and they read stories on the computer. And so they could take as much time as they wanted as they were reading the bulk of the story. But then they advanced to the next screen, which had a one-sentence ending. And their job was to answer as quickly as possible whether that one-sentence ending was a logical ending to the story or whether it was a complete non sequitur. And when it was a non sequitur, the plot changed, the characters changed, right? Everything was different. And so they were reading a bunch of different stories, but two of them were two of the ones I had just mentioned, is getting into Stanford and getting called on in class. And in those stories, they always read a logical negative ending. After several moments of silence, the professor calls on you, or a month later, John receives a rejection letter from Stanford. So they should always answer yes, this is a logical ending. But the question is, how fast can they say that? And the idea is that as they're reading the story, if that negative outcome has already come to mind, then they will be faster to be able to say, yes, that's a logical ending. And so we predict when they read the version where the protagonist has tempted fate, they're going to be faster to recognize that negative ending compared to if they read the other story, if they were randomly assigned to read the control story. And so this is the speed, the time to say that the negative ending makes sense, with lower numbers being faster. And as we predicted, we see that for both of the stories, participants are faster to recognize the negative ending if they read the story where fate had been tempted. In another study, we wanted to be sure that it wasn't all outcomes that were accessible, but specifically the negative ones that were accessible. So we did the Stanford story again, but this time, in addition to manipulating whether they saw the tempting fate version or not, they also read either the negative or the positive ending, right? And we only expect this pattern on the negative ending. We expect them to be slower to recognize the positive ending where he gets accepted to Stanford. And that's what we found. So the speed was the faster for recognizing the rejection ending when he tested fate, but slower to recognize the acceptance. We also wanted to measure the speed and the likelihood judgments in the same study. Up until then, we had done it separately, but we wanted to see whether it was their speed that was driving their likelihood judgments. So after they said whether an ending made sense or not, they were prompted, if they said yes, it makes sense, they were prompted to say how likely it was. As we saw in other studies, people thought that he was more likely to be rejected if he tempted fate, less likely to be accepted. And I don't have the mediation model up here, but statistically speaking, it was their speed to answer whether it made sense that's driving their likelihood judgments. That's sort of driving the effect of which story they were reading. And the last study that I'll mention from this package thinks about this question of whether it occurs automatically. So we had half of participants read this story about getting called on in class, and just answer under regular conditions. And as we had found in an earlier study, people who read the version where they weren't prepared for class thought it was more likely that they would be called on. But then what we manipulated was whether they were under cognitive load. So the first group is doing this regularly. The other group is under cognitive load, which means that we're giving them another simultaneous task to complete that's meant to tax their working memory so that they don't have as much sort of system 2 capabilities left to process the story. So while they're reading the story and answering the likelihood judgments, they're also being asked to count backwards by 3s from the number 564. And so they're doing this simultaneously. And the idea is that if doing this, if this judgment, this magical sort of judgment, this effect that we see here requires working memory, then it would be knocked out. But our suggestion is that when you tax working memory, you're actually going to see sort of the truer form of a magical belief, because you're not going to be able to correct for recognizing that it doesn't matter whether you're prepared or not. And indeed, that's what we found, that when people are under cognitive load, the effect of the manipulation becomes much stronger. That we see when people are not able to sort of bring their full sort of cognitive resources to the table, we see that the effect is larger than when they can. It's still there when they can, but not as strong. And so those studies were meant to highlight some of those predictions that the belief in tempting fate builds on availability and can occur automatically. I have other papers that have looked at this idea of being widespread, so even among very educated populations, you see magical beliefs, like people are reluctant to exchange lottery tickets. And what I love about this is they're not reluctant because they think their ticket is especially likely to win. So it's not an over-optimism about my ticket being special. It's closer, it's part of the sort of tempting fate set of behaviors. It's that they imagine that if I were to exchange it, then it becomes more likely to win. And that's what you find. And so especially the more negative the person is who would hold your ticket, the more likely you think it is that that ticket would win in the hands of someone else. We've also done work looking at different rituals that people have for undoing bad luck. So if you think that you brought bad luck upon yourself, we've looked at different behaviors like knocking on wood, and in other cultures you see throwing salt or spitting, all of these things designed to sort of undo the bad luck. It does affect people's perceived likelihood, right? It doesn't change the objective likelihood of bad things happening, but if people knock down on a wood table after jinxing themselves, they think that the bad outcome is less likely to occur than if they don't knock down. And then the last one on this set is investing in karma. If you have people think about something that they want from the universe, something that's important that's out of their control, they're waiting to get into a school or to get a job or for medical test results, they're particularly likely to do good deeds. So that's what you're going to get them donating more money, donating more of their time. And so one of my favorite studies at a job fair, where everybody wants the same thing, but we manipulate whether the process feels like it's in your control or out of your control. When the process is made to feel out of your control, they donate a bigger portion of their potential winnings to charity, as if that's going to then sort of curry favor in terms of getting the job. And so, broadly speaking, I think the dual process account, the basic one, can help explain why these beliefs are widespread, why particular kinds of beliefs are common, and why the beliefs are maintained even though they're not true. But what we left off from the beginning is this idea of why they're maintained even when people know they're not true. And so that's why I want to refine the model. An unstated assumption of the basic model is that if you detect an error, you correct it. And that is so perfectly reasonable in so many contexts, right? When I give you the bat and the ball example, if you realize that 10 cents can't be the right answer, why would you give 10 cents as the answer? Or if you realize you switch the days of your sort of doctor's appointment, you're not going to show up on the wrong day. There's all sorts of examples where it makes perfect sense that you would correct an error that you recognize. And yet, in the superstition and magical thinking space, what we see time and again is that people will recognize in the moment that this is crazy and do it anyway. And so I think that's why it's not surprising that those have been put together before, but I think once you sort of, this space is also a space where it seems so clear that they shouldn't stay together. And so what I'm going to say is, to describe is, if you detect an error but you don't correct it, that's what I'm going to refer to as acquiescence. And I think that if we decouple error detection and error correction in our model, then we have a way to sort of explain acquiescence that occurs. The idea here is that even though it's inspired from magical thinking, it's not meant to only apply there. That once we sort of recognize that it should be decoupled, then it can apply to all sorts of intuitive beliefs where there's a conflict between an intuitive belief and a rational knowledge, even outside of sort of the world of superstition and magical thinking. But basically, we're just going to separate this into two layers. And so here, if you detect the error but you don't correct it, then that's what I'm going to describe as acquiescence. And so the modified account also has a set of predictions. This is the one that I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about, just this basic idea. Is acquiescence real? Is that actually true? And I find when I talk about some of this work, I get such mixed reactions. Some people sort of, from the quotes at the beginning or from their own lives and experiences, are sort of totally on board and are kind of like, sure, yeah, that seems right. And then the rest of this, all of the rest of this is going to feel like complete overkill and unnecessary to you. Because from another position, this is like incredibly controversial. Because it's one thing to say people aren't rational because they don't realize that they're being irrational. But to say that people will sometimes be irrational knowing that they're being irrational makes some people very, very uncomfortable. And so the rest of this is really designed to sort of be an existence proof. Can we get actual sort of evidence that people are definitely acquiescing to their intuition? And so you may already be on board, and then I say thank you. But if you're not, the rest of sort of the evidence here is really just meant to show empirically that this can actually happen, even for people who find it kind of discomforting. And then there's other predictions that I am sort of following up in other research, and maybe I'll have a chance to talk to you about that when we're all done. So what I'll do is first highlight two examples of acquiescence. Karen, can you remind me when you want me to finish up? Because I can just...
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mention two examples of acquiescence, but sort of suggest to you, even though they've always seemed like acquiescence to me, at least put a little bug in your head for why maybe we can't be so sure. Why we actually have to run studies to be sort of more careful about that. And then I'll probably just skip to one of these tests, my favorite of them, to tell you about showing them. So this is one of my very favorite studies. Paul Rosin and his colleagues ran this, which is about nominal realism, the idea that objects take on the properties of the name that it has. So people come into the lab and they have two empty bowls and a bag of sugar. And they're asked to pour the bag of sugar into the two bowls. Then they're given two labels, one that says poison, sodium cyanide, and one that says sugar. And they get to decide which label they put on which bowl. And now they have to use sugar from one of the bowls. And people don't want to use the sugar that's labeled poison. They poured the sugar themselves, they labeled it themselves, and they don't want to use it. And so when he writes about this in other work, he says they realized that their negative feelings were unfounded, but felt and acknowledged them anyway. And I've sort of always taken this as a great example of acquiescence. I realize this is crazy, but I'm still going to use the sugar that's labeled sugar. The other example is not magical thinking, and this is partly just to sort of make it clear that this is meant to extend beyond magical thinking. So this is something called the ratio bias paradigm. So people are presented with two different potential lotteries, and you're told that if you draw a red marble, you win, right? You win $5 or whatever it is in this particular context, but you don't only see the pictures, you get to know exactly what's inside. You get the full table. And as it turns out, Tray B has a better percentage of winning marbles. But for a lot of people, the fact that there are so many more winning marbles over here makes it feel like it's easier to win. That there's only one way to win over there. And look, I have so many ways to win over here. Mind you, you also have many more ways to lose, but that's not what people are focused on. And so when you set up conflicts where the number of winners is higher in one and the percentage of winners is better in the other, if you do studies where there's sort of multiple trials of this type, you'll see something like 80% of people choosing the inferior bowl at least once. maybe an ad of like 4 or 5 tiles. So it's not every time, but you see a lot of people choosing the bowl that's not as good. And again, I've always taken this as an example of acquiescence. You see what the percentages are. What are you doing here? But is it really acquiescence? It requires that you have a faulty intuition. And these studies that only look at behavior don't actually test that, right? So do people have the intuition something bad would happen if they use sugar from the poison bowl? Or is their behavior being driven by something else? And it also requires that people know that their intuition is wrong. And even though it seems so obvious, that may not actually be true for people, right? So do people actually know it's irrational to care about the label? Do they know that the 10% is better than the 9%? We don't know that because we don't ask. And so the criteria, I think, sort of are probably pretty straightforward from what I've described, is that someone has to have a faulty intuition, right? They have a faulty set of expectations about what's likely to happen. They recognize that that intuition is irrational. They know that that's not true, that's not the facts about the world. And they stick with their intuition knowing it's irrational. And I think acquiescence is supported with evidence for these 3, but in all of my studies I'm going to include at least some small cost for following your intuition so that we can say it's more than a tiebreaker. So in the sugar example, you can say, well, why not use the sugar that's labeled sugar? There's no reason to use the other one. Whereas in the ratio bias, there is an expected cost to choosing the not as good one. So in all of my studies, I'm always going to at least include some cost of following your intuition so that we can say acquiescence exists and it exists beyond just being sort of a tiebreaker. And for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through study 4 and study 5. The highlights are study 4, we have support for criteria 1 and 2, but not criteria 3. In study 5, we have support for all 3 criteria. But study 6 is my favorite, which is why you're seeing me skip all the way to it. So here we're going to use blackjack, and I like it partly because instead of all the other ones are sort of made-up games, this is a real game that people could actually play. And what we do is we're going to have people provide their intuitive judgments for different hands of blackjack. And then in round 2, they're going to play an incentivized game of blackjack, but they're going to play with the blackjack strategy table. So they know what they're supposed to do. And we're going to see how often they do that and when they deviate from the table. And do they deviate from the table more when their intuition is in conflict with the table? And so we're going to compare responses for 2 hands. One where there's a conflict between the table and the hand, and one when there isn't. So here's the table, and it's just standing and hitting, so we don't have splitting or double down or anything like that in the study. And these are the 2 hands that we chose based on pre-testing to be the critical hands. When you have a 13 and you're facing a 4, the table says you should stand. The table also says you should stand when you have an 8, when you have a soft 18 facing an 8. What's nice about these 2 hands is that if you stand instead of hit, you improve your chances of winning by almost exactly the same amount, which is 3%. Right? So it's better to stand than hit for both of them, but the amount that it's better to stand than hit is almost exactly the same. So objectively, we're trying to match these 2 hands. But what's different about them is that people think that they should hit on this hand, and people think they should stand on this hand. And so we found that out with our pre-testing. So people have the faulty intuition about the 13, and 2/3 of people wanted to hit even though they shouldn't, whereas people were right about the other one. So when we got to the actual study, we knew which hands to use. In the first round, this is just replicating the pre-test, right? We're just going to look at their judgments. How likely are you to win if you hit? How likely are you to win if you stand for the different hands? And indeed, on the 13, we see people have the faulty intuition. And they have the right intuition for the other hand. What do? This is when we give them the strategy table and we explain it to them. I'm not going to read this all to you, but we say the table is created by running computer simulations of millions of blackjack hands. Therefore, a player using reason and rational analysis would follow the table's advice on every hand if he or she wanted to maximize the chance of winning the hand. Importantly, a player will not win every hand by following the table's advice. Nonetheless, for any given hand, following the table offers the best possible chance of winning. They have to take a little quiz so that they understand it. And then when they play the game, they have to click on the right cell before they can move on. Then they have to answer this question based on reason. what should you do if you want to maximize your chance of winning the hand? They can answer whatever they want there, and then they get to play out the hand on the next page, and they're incentivized to win. And so almost everybody gets this right, which is pretty good. You would have from the other studies, sometimes we're more or less successful in having people actually know what the rational thing is to do. But then when it comes to their choices, we see this difference across the conditions. So that people are much more likely to deviate from the table and hit when they're facing the 13 than when they're facing the 18, even though the table tells them the exact same thing. And this is even true if you just focus on the people who got it right, which is an important part of sort of satisfying the criteria. And so I think like the one study that I switched over, I think we have evidence for all three criteria. What's especially nice about this study is we have this continuous measure of intuitive beliefs from the first round, and that predicts their decision. So the more likely you thought you were to win from hitting on 13, the more likely you are to deviate from the table, even though you just told me that what you're supposed to do is stand. Right? So you know what you're supposed to do, and you don't do it. And the people who don't do it are the ones who sort of have the strongest intuition about hitting. And so I think this ends up being, at least thus far, our best evidence for acquiescence. The studies were designed just to be sort of a concept proof that this actually can occur, but you can also think about whether there's any way to estimate how common it is. We can't say anything about how common it is in everyday life, but what we can say is, given that someone's having a conflict, given that they have the intuitive belief and that they know it's irrational, how often do people acquiesce versus how often do people correct? And so across these three studies, when people experience the conflict, we see a third here acquiescing and 2/3 correcting. In the next study, we see half of the people who experience it. Blackjack, we had our best success in getting people to experience the conflict, and here we see 39-61. So I think more than just saying that this can occur, when people are having the conflict, it looks like between 1/3 and 1/2 of the time in these studies, people are not correcting, but are following their intuition, which to me says that it's not just something sort of that can happen, but that it's worth understanding why it happens, when it happens, who it happens to, and sort of that it's real enough that it's worth sort of following it up. And so, to summarize, superstitions and magical intuitions are widespread. They build on general purpose heuristics and can occur automatically. And I think in this recent work, what I want to suggest is that even beyond anecdotes, we have evidence that people will stick with intuitions that they recognize in the moment are irrational. And I think we can accommodate and understand this by just sort of advancing and sort of refining the way the dual process model is thought about. These are some of the other future directions that relate to this different model, but I'll just leave it up there, and if you have questions about one of these, but I can answer questions about anything else too. Thanks.
It's totally poison.
What?
It's totally poison. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
In your research, did you, first, thank you.
Yeah.
Did you look at the actual process of being with a group of people who's all sort of buying into this together? I mean, if I'm a Cubs fan, I'm not home alone watching the game, wearing my jersey. I'm probably out someplace with other people also wearing their jerseys.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
So, I love the question, and mostly because it's sort of a big open space in the way that this has been studied. There has not been nearly enough research, including my own for sure, thinking about the social aspects of this. Mm-hmm. Now, there's two different forms of the social aspect. One, the one that especially when you give the Cubs example, that brings up all sorts of identity relevant kinds of things. And so there's a version in which this is, especially with sports teams, it's like when I do this, I am showing who is my in-group. If you don't do it, you're not in the in-group, right? So there's all sorts of other kinds of psychology that we know will get layered upon, so that whether or not you actually believe it, the behaviors and all sorts of things can be sort of related, because there's the social aspect of it provides other parts of it. But from the way that I've been thinking about it more, so I think that that's all important to think through. The way that I've been thinking about it more is that what the social group does, and so if we think more just about shared superstitions, not necessarily like a group like a particular sports fan, but just things like that black cats are bad luck, or breaking mirrors are bad luck, these sort of generally sort of culturally shared superstitions. What they do is that they give you, the fact that other people believe it means that you entertain it as a possibility. So because it's sort of part of our cultural consciousness, you consider this in a way that you don't consider any other millions of things that could just as easily be something that you were sort of tracking in your mind. And then so all of the processes like the confirmation bias and our memory biases and all the things that lead us to sort of create beliefs are going to be attached to certain kinds of beliefs more than others. And so the fact that other people believe it means that at least you're going to entertain it as a possibility. And so people will often say, you know, to try to explain why do you do this if you don't believe it, and they say, well, I don't believe it, but it just seems better safe than sorry. And that drives me a little crazy. Because what does it mean better safe than sorry? In my mind, when you say it's better safe than sorry, I think what you are telling me is you are at least considering that it might be true. Right? And you may not, and this is kind of, you're not explicitly endorsing this as, yes, I believe it to be true, but you are at least recognizing the possibility that it's true, which is what I'm calling sort of the system one intuition. And that's what I think we get so much from other people. There's lots of idiosyncratic superstitions and magical beliefs also that occur individually, right? You start picking up on your own patterns. They don't all have to work that way. But I think that those socially shared ones work in large part because it just becomes one potential belief to consider instead of all the other things, right? We don't pick up bottle caps and consider them lucky, but we do pick up four-leaf clovers, and so if something good happens after you see a four-leaf clover, that would confirm one superstition, and you've never thought to pay attention after you see a bottle cap. You've never thought to pick it up, because nobody told you you ought to. So there's both elements, both the sort of the social parts of it, that's sort of why it's like rewarding in a social way, but also that the social part of it changes what you might actually believe on your own. Yeah.
Can you go back to the slide about the poison sugar that talks about the negative feeling of...
Oh, the quote?
Yeah. Because I was wondering if, I mean, if there's anything to say about the kind of stress of making a decision against even just, not just an intuition, but a feeling, right? So it's like, if there's no, we might know there's no cost to eating the sugar you labeled poison, but it also just feels better not to. So of course and similarly with like knocking on wood after you talk about something bad happening.
Right.
It's self-soothing. I don't know. Like why go to the extra emotional effort to override those things?
Yeah. So you're digging right into all of the most interesting psychology. The short answer is sort of the reason that I've laid out the criteria the way that I have. You see, emotion is not actually listed as part of it, which is to say that I don't think emotion is necessary or sufficient, but I think that that's probably the best, when we try to understand the question of why does this happen, the answer is most of the time going to be the emotional costs, right? So when are you going to sort of, if we think of these moments where I have an intuition and I recognize that it's wrong, when am I going to sort of correct it and go with what's rational? Well, when the stakes are changed such that the cost of ignoring rationality, if the cost of ignoring rationality go up, I'm going to be more rational. If the cost of ignoring intuition go up, I'm going to follow my intuition. And I think emotion in particular is what's going to make that really palpable. For me, though, to call it acquiescence, I do have to show evidence that there is a faulty intuitive belief. So if I couldn't show that, if all I knew was that there was emotion, that you would feel bad using that poison, but I couldn't get evidence that you thought something bad would happen in terms of an expectation, then I wouldn't call that acquiescence. It would be a very related phenomenon, but at least the way that I'm thinking about it, it would have to require the intuitive belief be there. Now, I think the intuitive belief and the emotion are completely wrapped up in one another. And so it's more for sort of articulating things and sort of saying what's going to count and what's not than in terms of the actual experience of it. I think it's very likely to include all of that emotion. I had one study that I skipped over where, in fact, you're so clued into things that I was really lucky and I had the chance to talk to Daniel Kahneman about some of this. And he said, how do we know it's not just emotion? If you want to show that it's not just emotion, I would need to see you test this when it's for someone else. So if you showed me that I had the faulty intuition about somebody else, then that doesn't seem like it's as likely to be of emotion, then it seems like it's more about sort of my beliefs about the states of the world. So we ran that. It was the envelope scenario that I skipped through, but we did it where we ran it for self or other. And so when someone was imagining someone else in that situation, they also had the faulty intuition, and they also thought the person should do the sort of intuition following thing. Even there, you could say maybe they were just simulating the emotion that they had for themselves, so it's not a perfect solution, but I do think we have to be able to show that the intuition, the faulty intuition is there, to call it acquiescence, and I think emotion is the thing that's probably what makes it so hard to ignore that intuition. That was a long answer, but it was a great question. Yeah?
In the first half, you mentioned subjecting people to cognitive load, and I was curious about that in two respects. First, just what the details of that were in the experimental situation, and then second, whether in the field that's a sort of generic procedure in the sense that you can have an experiment and then also say, let's do that, but with more cognitive load.
Yeah, so what I did, in that study, people were asked to count backwards by threes from a high number, from 500 to 64, so that was the simultaneous task that they were asked to do. Cognitive load is a common manipulation in our field, and there's two ways to do it. Cognitive load, people will use the term cognitive load to refer to two different kinds of manipulations. Typically, one is the simultaneous task, which is when they're asked to do something else that requires their working memory. Another thing is sometimes people will be forced to speed up. So the other way people will talk about load, it's not quite load, but they're used the same way to sort of test this, is it happening automatically or not, is to force people to give a quick response. So a speeded response or giving people a simultaneous task are the two prominent ways. What that other task is looks different, and you need to pre-test it with your sample, right, so that you're getting the right sort of load on a given sample. You wouldn't necessarily think it would work for all people the same way. And then there's been some good work that shows sort of that the tax on working memory depends exactly on how it's done, so that if you're trying to tax, so you may want to sort of think through taxing, whether it's linguistic or numeric or things like that. So there is, some people have dived way into the literature just on sort of what does cognitive load mean. And there's a lot more to look at, but it's a pretty common way in the literature to say, to test whether or not a process requires cognitive resources or not. Yeah?
Are there any studies on targeting possible step 3 where you justify your iteration over the other process if you prefer that to be true?
If you prefer it to be true? Yeah, so I think that's sort of a nice extra part here, is that I think what people will often do is what you might call rationalizing the intuition, right? And then it gets really tricky for me in studying it. This is one of the things, I think I have it listed up here, how to use this method to try to distinguish reasons from rationalizations. Because for me, again, if I can document that you have the faulty intuition, then even if you know that intuition is wrong, then even if you say your behavior was caused by something else, if I can show that it's the intuition driving it, I would still want to call it acquiescence. Now it's different in kind, because what the difference is everything I talked about today was sort of you recognizing that your belief is irrational and that the behavior is irrational. What you're describing, people would think that their belief was irrational, but they would then try to claim that the behavior was rational for some other reason. And that becomes really tricky. So in these lab settings, what I try to do is sort of, if you come to these very sort of simple conditions where there's really only one goal, it makes it much easier that you can't come up with all sorts of other explanations for why you're doing it. But in the real world, of course, there's 1,000 other things that you could be thinking about. And so it becomes really hard for me to distinguish a reason from a rationalization. And I have ideas, like in theory, about how you would do that, right? If you undermine a reason, the behavior should change. If you undermine a rationalization, another rationalization should pop up. But actually getting that into the lab setting feels, I am not there yet. But that's an important thing. And so I think trying to undermine the intuition feels like the best way to try to change the behavior.
We only have time for one more, so you two have one question.
Oh, no. Okay, so.
Quick
Okay, so-
process.
Oh, okay.
Have you done any studies to find out whether the intuitions are there to correct for, like, whether there are situations where the intuition is shown to be right and we're not sure why, or that gives that explanation?
So no, I haven't done any studies like that, but I hear, I think, what is in the background of your question, which I agree with, is that I don't want to take the position, and if I don't want to take the position that sort of that system, that sort of the rational answer is always right. It's not always right. First of all, it depends on what you're trying to do in the situation. So you might have other goals, and so what is rational in this sort of specific situation may not be, that behavior may not be rational for a sort of a broader set of goals. So that's partly why, again, why I sort of try to bring things very small so that we don't have those extra layers, but you're absolutely right that it could be that there's something else you're trying to do. And also, in the studies I've done so far, I've tried to make the rational part absolutely clear. But in some of my other work, like in terms of something like the table tells you what you should do probabilistically. Now you might doubt probability, but at least that's sort of there, it's sort of there. But there's things where it becomes more complicated, like trusting scientists, right? So I've done some work, not in this space per se, but on beliefs in global warming and what sort of pushes our intuitions about global warming. Do we want people to sort of believe the scientists? Well, I very much do there. Then it comes to GMOs that I'm interested in now. And GMOs is a place, 88% of scientists say GMOs are safe. People are not on board with that. That's the biggest gap in a recent poll. That's the biggest gap. And people, this is an interesting one because liberals and conservatives flip here compared to global warming in terms of who's not trusting the scientists. And there's this feeling that there's something we don't know yet. And so if you're trying to say, like, is the knowledge, is the rational, is what the scientists say, is that right? Is that rational? It becomes a more complicated story compared to the things that I'm sort of starting with. So intuition can certainly pick up on things that you might know, but just because it's picking up on something doesn't mean that it's right. You pick up on a lot of things. And so I neither want to claim that intuition is always picking up on something that's true. There's plenty of examples where we pick up on things that are totally not true. But I also don't want to sort of dismiss the idea that intuition is always, that rational knowledge is always right. It depends on the kinds of rational knowledge that we're actually dealing with. I'm pretty comfortable following probability. I think you should choose from the bowl that has 10 more than 9. But if someone says, well, but I really feel like it's going to happen here, and it's rational to trust my intuition, I don't quite know how to what does that mean to me? Okay, so you think that I don't know what to call that then. That becomes hard for me to think through. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.